A few weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal announced we have our first trillionaire. I'm sure you're aware that Elon Musk made shares of SpaceX available to the public, and almost overnight, he became the first trillionaire in history. In a separate article in that same paper, the writer suggests that it's hard for us to even get our mind around what a trillion could be. He said even mathematicians struggle with making that clear. So to give us a sense of the enormity, he says only 19 countries in the world have a GDP of $1 trillion. He said imagine that 1 million seconds is 2 weeks ago. 1 billion seconds puts us back in 1994. 1 trillion seconds would put us back in the Ice Age. Imagine that. It's his way of saying, this is absurd, ridiculous, outrageous. But I have no doubt, if we were offered $1 trillion today, every one of us would say, okay, sure. Have you watched any of the television series, The Gilded Age? Belinda and I have watched all of it. It's a period drama. It's set in New York City in the late 19th century during the Gilded Age. And while it takes some liberties with history, as television always does, it nonetheless represents how wealth and power got in the hands of a few elites. People like the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts and the Carnegies, and how they used that wealth and that power to create monopolies, to influence politics, and to control the economy for their own benefit. Does that sound familiar? Wall Street Journal, in that article, warns us that it looks like we too have moved into a second Gilded Age. The good news, though, is that none of us seated here are trillionaires or billionaires. And so we're off the hook when it comes to this business of the sin of greed, right? Wrong. Today, I'm in part 5 of the series I've been doing on the 7 deadly sins. And the sin, avarice or greed, comes from the Latin word avere, which means to crave, to yearn for. Or what Peter Jones in his book, Self-Help from the Middle Ages, calls a cycle of desire. It just goes round and round and never ends. He reminds us that St. Paul in Colossians and Ephesians says that greed is a way of serving idols because it compels us to make sacrifices of time, energy, and effort, to devote ourselves to things that have no soul, to things that are not God. Jones tells this hilarious but cautionary tale about himself that illustrates the power of material desire. When he was living in Siberia, in that miserable cold, in winter, he found his way, he said, to this large, shining mall where it was truly warm inside. And everything was beautiful. And there was a Starbucks. And there were all these wonderful clothing shops. And he said, before I knew what I was doing, I love that, before I knew what I was doing, I found myself trying on this mustard-colored woolen sweater. And he said, I've often found myself like this in a fitting room with this thing that I'm trying on, and I feel this urgency, this sense that I have to have this particular object right now. Only it right now can fill this need that is deep inside of me. He said, and then he gets home with all his bags and boxes and realized that he feels the same way as he did before. After my mother died, my brothers and I were cleaning out her house, and we discovered in her closet at least a dozen items, skirts, blouses, sweaters, that still had price tags, big price tags on them. Never been worn. Obviously, she loved them in the shop, but not so much when she got home. Isn't that what retail therapy is all about? It doesn't really work We're feeling boxed in, frustrated, lonely, antsy, and so we go shopping. And the energy, the dazzle of the shops lifts our spirits. And we see so many things that we just can't live without. And we buy them and we take them home, and 24 hours later, we're back in the same blah place. A year later, we don't even know where they are. How many of you know the name Petula Clark? 4. 6. Hey, oh, now you're getting brave because other people said they know her. Right. Well, I'm glad some of you know her. I've always liked Petula Clark. She's very famous in the 60s and 70s. She's British. One of her songs became particularly famous, Downtown. Yeah. So don't miss the lyrics, all right? When you're alone and life is making you lonely, you can always go downtown. When you've got worries, all the noise and the hurry seems to help, I know. Downtown, just listen to the music of the traffic in the city. Linger on the sidewalk where the neon lights are pretty. How can you lose? The lights are much brighter there. You can forget all your troubles, forget all your cares when you go downtown. There things will be great when you're downtown. No finer place for sure. Downtown, everything's waiting for you. Oh boy, I mean, there's sadness to that. Yeah. There's sadness to that because it's saying when you're feeling lonely, when you're troubled, when you're worrying, when life is bad, just go downtown. And the guy who wrote that song, himself a Brit, was visiting America at the time on business, and he was pretty down. He had some stuff going on in his life. And so he decided to wander over, he was in Manhattan, to wander over to Times Square. He'd never visited it before. And he said somehow, all that glitter, the signs, the people, the shops, the restaurants, it just made me feel better. And that's where the song came from. I think that it was so popular in the 60s because of this. There were a lot of harsh realities in the 60s. A lot of horrible assassinations. John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., the upheaval of the Civil Rights Movement, the fear of nuclear war with Russia, the Vietnam War. And it was during that very era of the 60s that not only did Downtown become a #1 hit, but also consumerism began to grow in a way that it never had before. Retail therapy. Escape all this bad stuff. Go buy something. 60 years later, we don't need downtown. We just pick up our phones or sit down at the computer, Amazon.com, right? All kinds of stuff out there to discover that we didn't even know was out there. And we're going to order it, and it'll be right at the front door within days, if not within hours. We've had a couple of times within hours. Wow. So dangerous. St. Paul's letter to his young protege, Timothy, says this: the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And while none of us sitting here, as far as I know, are trillionaires or billionaires, compared to most of the rest of the world, we are nonetheless wealthy. And really, it's not about how much we have, but the role it plays in our lives. Now get this straight, St. Paul does not say that money is the root of all evil. He gets misquoted a lot. What he says is the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. There is no doubt that money can do a lot of good too. Hospitals, medical research, churches, schools, libraries, care for the poor. But when money and the things that lure us into buying because of our money become primary in our lives, when they become dominating realities, then we are creeping into exactly what St. Paul says. We've moved to the realm of idolatry. When money, when the stuff we can buy with money gives us our sense of identity. We need to ask ourselves that question: do I really get my sense of who I am and how I function in the world because of what I own? Our sense of security. when those things become our primary shaper in making decisions, then our money has become a god. Jesus does not say that all the wealthy people are idolaters, but he does say that it's hard for the wealthy, that's us, to get into the kingdom of heaven because we tend to allow our wealth to be our God, to trust our stock investments, the real estate we own, all the stuff we have, trust that stuff to define us and to be our security more than God. You remember, Jesus did not tell every wealthy person to get rid of all their wealth. Look at Zacchaeus, the little rich man that climbed up the sycamore tree to see Jesus. He did end up giving a lot out of his experience with Jesus, but Jesus didn't say, you got to give it all up. But he did tell the rich young ruler to give all of his away. So what's the difference? Well, obviously, one of those men had a greater attachment to wealth. The rich young ruler, it seems, was too caught up in his wealth. In this morning's gospel lesson, Jesus, just a few verses before what I just read, tells the disciples, you don't need to be fearful of those things that can harm the body. You need to be fearful of those things that can harm the soul. He warns them to be careful of greed because he says our identity, our lives, are not to be defined by our possessions. And that's when he then launches into this parable. There's a wealthy man, he had a bumper crop. Oh my gosh, he had more than he'd ever had before. He didn't know what to do with it all. He had these little tiny barns. He couldn't give them a lot to the poor. But what he decided is, what I'll do is I'll just tear down all those little barns. I'll build these huge barns, and I can pack all my stuff into those barns. And then I can sit back, relax, be happy, eat, drink, be merry. And then in the parable, as you heard, God says, you fool, your life will end this very night. Then what's going to happen to all your stuff? It'll end up at a yard sale. Your children will have a big yard sale, and that'll be that. And so it says in the parable, those who store up treasures for themselves and are not rich in God must beware. Now, perhaps if we were retelling this story for wealthy Americans, instead of focusing on crops and barns, we would focus on cash investments, real estate, mutual funds, 401ks. But as with the farmer, the issue is not having the crops or having the investments, but thinking that we can find our security, our strength, our meaning in those things, getting too caught up in our own sense of privilege and not having any gratitude to God, not having any care for the poor, allowing our possessions to define who we are. Now, you heard that reading from Exodus. It says basically the same thing as the gospel, but in a different way. God had blessed the people of Israel. You remember that? He'd done this miraculous thing. He delivered them out of slavery under Pharaoh, leading them out toward the promised land. But now they're going through a tough moment, and they're angry and mad and cursing and carrying on. Isn't that like us? You know, God might bless us 100 times, but then we get to a bad place, we forgot about all that. Now we're just mad. What's this happening to me? This is awful. Where are you, God? And that's what they say. And God shows up, and he sends them manna in the wilderness, food to sustain them. But he says, don't try to hoard it. He knew his children, right? Don't try to hoard it. Just take enough to feed you and your family for the day. But they don't do that. They try to hoard it. They sneak out there. They get extra. They bring it in. You know, they want to have more than the neighbor has. You don't know what's going to happen just in case. And it rots overnight. I thought to myself when I was rereading that for this sermon, wouldn't it be an interesting thing if money rotted overnight? Oh boy, yeah. And that's what this was like for them. The only thing they had to depend on was this little bit of food, and it rotted. So the next day they're like, oh my gosh, we're back in this vulnerable situation. And the whole point of that story, the whole point of that experience in the wilderness was for God to teach his people to rely on him and not on earthly things. Daily bread. Give us this day our daily bread. Learning to trust God day by day, to find our security, our hope, our identity in God. Peter Jones, in this book that some of us have been reading, Self-Help from the Middle Ages, What the Seven Deadly Sins Can Teach Us About Living, shows us that greed and consumerism are not something new to modern man. That even back in the Middle Ages, this idea of consumerism was growing rapidly. Slaves were bought and sold. Governments were investing in trade ships. Beautiful objects that people had never seen before that were coming from foreign countries because of the Silk Road, this trading system that covered 3 different continents. It created a sense of competitiveness because people in Europe discovered that people in Egypt, people in the Middle East had things that they didn't have. And, why do they have more and we don't have more? And there's this, this competition. And of course it established a large aristocracy, the elites. But then after the Black Death, he tells us it also established a strong middle class that was in the same kind of competitive spirit as the elites. And it's in that section that he focuses us then on one solitary person, St. Francis of Assisi. And we think of St. Francis as all about animals, right? I mean, that's why we love him. We love animals, so we love him. But you have to realize that that was not the majority of his focus. The majority of his focus was on the poor, on caring for the poor, on living like and with the poor, on living a simple life utterly dependent on God. Now, you remember, Francis was born to wealth. His father was one of those silk merchants. They had a lot of money. He was very privileged, and he ate it up when he was young. But then he went in the army. Those of you who've been in the service know what that can do to you. He went in the army, and his city-state was in war against another city-state, and he went off to war, and he got captured, and he got thrown in a dungeon and lived in horrible conditions for more than a year. He suffered. And he saw other people suffering. And so he came out a different man. He'd been changed. As he was making his way home with nothing, making his way home, he stopped in an abandoned church to sleep. And he had this vision of Jesus speaking from the crucifix, telling him to build God's church, to strengthen God's church. And he thought that meant to just build up that little church that was in poor repair. What he came to realize along the way, though, is that he was being called to a different kind of life, to create a different kind of Christian community, to make the church different. And so he renounced his wealth, his privilege, and made this daily commitment to owning nothing. No property, no money, no house, no books, entirely dependent on God. He wanted to be free from self-consciousness because he was fighting the 7 deadly sins, pride and envy and anger and all the others. He wanted to live differently. And a whole group of people began to crowd around Francis because he was showing a model of something that was so very different. And it raised up a whole group to this day called the Franciscans. So what does Peter Jones in that book say? Is he saying in this day and world, if we want to be faithful to Christ, we need to get rid of all the stuff? Sell it all, get rid of the house, get rid of the investments. Not necessarily. Some may be called to that. But what he clearly is saying in this world of great commerce is that we should possess things lightly so that they don't possess us. Francis warned that when we focus too much on external things, we neglect the internal things, the things of the heart and the soul. Peter Jones makes this insightful comment. When we channel all our time and energy into accumulating clothes, we risk reducing ourselves to mannequins. We become little more than frames for displaying the prizes we've hoarded. Clearly, he intends that to be applied not just to clothing, but to life in general. We have become such big consumers that everything ends up being about possessing and displaying and impressing. And he suggests that even religion can become a matter of consumerism. You ever heard about people shopping around for the right church? Looking for a certain kind of preacher, certain kind of service. It's just our consumer mentality. And that launches into this talk about the Holy Grail. You ever watched any of those movies about a Holy Grail? There are a lot of movies made, a lot of books written. Of course, my favorite, probably yours too, is Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. What's happening there? They're trying to get to the Holy Grail before the Nazis get to the Holy Grail. And what was the Holy Grail? Well, the Holy Grail was the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper. And Peter Jones says, that this search has gone on for centuries, real honest searches where people have lost their lives searching for the Holy Grail, long before there were movies about it. And he said, but don't fool yourself. It wasn't about godliness that they were pursuing the Holy Grail. It wasn't that they wanted to hold and touch something holy to bow before they put it in the church. It was none of that. It was really all about consumerism. The Grail, he reminds us, was thought to be magical. To drink from the Grail would cure you of illness. To drink from the Grail would cause you to live on and on and on. And that's why the Nazis wanted it, because they thought it would give them more power. They thought they could live longer, and they could certainly dominate the world with that. But more than that, says Jones, it was sought after because it was unattainable, beyond human grasp, an item that couldn't be bought. It makes me think of those advertisers who tell you, these items are in short supply. There are only a few left. Even on Amazon, you see there are only 3 left. Oh my gosh, let me hurry. I remember this wealthy parishioner many years ago who walked me through his very large mansion, showing me a lot of the things he'd bought over the years and commenting on several different items. This is one of a kind. This is one of a kind. No one else owns one like this. Too often, consumerism is about feeling special, better than others, having something that other people can't have. As with all the deadly sins, greed is about displaced love. C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, says that we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world will ever satisfy, and that is because we were made for a different world. And yet, he says, we go about pouring our energy, our thoughts, our work, our lives into these things that will never be enough. Some years ago, I became friends with an Anglican bishop in Uganda. I went and visited him a couple of times. He came and visited us a couple of times. And he helped me to see some facets of life differently through African eyes. When he visited here for the first time, he brought with him 2 other Africans who had never been out of Uganda. And they needed some toothpaste, and I made the mistake of taking them to Publix for their toothpaste. And they walked in, and they just stood paralyzed, looking around in awe of this place. And I had seen their little store in Uganda. It was about the size of our parish kitchen. No electricity, so of course no refrigerator or frozen goods, a dirt floor, simple shelves. And now here we were walking into this dazzling place, shining, clean, beautiful, absolutely everything you could imagine right there. And they were dazed by it, and I have to say that when I noticed that, I felt really embarrassed. We had in this one market more product than they had together seen in their entire lifetimes. And my experience was the same when I took them to Cool Beans for lunch. And they sat there poring over those menus, whispering back and forth to each other, and then the bishop leaned over and said, "Eric, do they just have fish and rice?" I said, "Yes, they have fish and rice." we would have fish and rice. They were too overwhelmed to even know how to order. Never in all their lives had they seen so many choices. And the people around us just sat oblivious to the privilege, just another meal out, just a quick lunch, that's all. Some days later, when the bishop was preparing to return to Africa, he said to me, "Eric, I will pray for you and for all the Christians in America. It must be so hard to stay faithful with so much."